The first thing Thatcher Calloway heard on the morning of his 18th
They kicked me
birthday
out at
was the
18
scrape of a chair across the
and
wooden
left me
floor.
with this
It
worthless
came from the
ranch.
dining room where the family lawyer had spread several documents across the table. Outside, early autumn sunlight stretched across the ranch yard, catching the dust that drifted through the open doorway. Thatcher already knew why everyone had gathered. His grandfather had been buried 3 days earlier. Silas Calloway had been the only person who had ever looked at Thatcher as though he belonged. Now he was gone. Thatcher stepped into the room, wearing the same worn work shirt he'd used for morning chores. His hands still smelled faintly of leather and horses. Across the table sat his stepfather, Roderick Harlan, perfectly dressed despite the hour. He leaned back with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the morning would end exactly as he wanted. The attorney cleared his throat. "Mr. Silas Calloway's estate has been divided according to his final instructions. Most of the cattle, the large homestead, the equipment, the investment accounts, they all passed to Roderick through his late wife's legal arrangements." Then came the final page. "There remains one separate property." The lawyer unfolded an old survey map. "Briarstone Ridge." Roderick laughed before the attorney finished reading. "That patch of rock." The lawyer nodded. "It has been left entirely to Thatcher Calloway." Silence filled the room. Then Roderick slid a folded document across the table. "Congratulations. You've inherited a ranch nobody wanted." He stood and tossed a small canvas bag onto the floor. "I believe your grandfather expected you to make something of yourself. So you might as well start today." Thatcher looked at the bag. Everything he owned fit inside it. 2 shirts, 1 spare pair of boots, a pocket knife, his grandfather's old compass. Nothing else. No one argued. No one asked him to stay. He quietly picked up the deed, folded the survey, lifted the canvas bag over his shoulder. As he reached the front porch, Roderick called after him. "One piece of advice. When winter comes, don't expect anyone to rescue you." The ride to Briarstone Ridge took nearly 2 days. The farther Thatcher traveled, the rougher the roads became. Fence posts leaned at odd angles. Creeks narrowed into trickles. Old ranch houses stood empty, surrendered years earlier to drought and debt. By late afternoon on the second day, he reached the property line. The entrance marker had nearly disappeared beneath climbing vines. The cabin stood crooked against the hillside. Several shingles were missing from the roof. One barn wall had collapsed completely. The corral gates hung from broken hinges. The windmill no longer turned. Anyone else would have turned around. Thatcher didn't. He tied his horse beneath the only surviving cottonwood tree and walked the land until sunset. He noticed things others might ignore. The grass wasn't dead, only neglected. The creek bed was dry, but its banks suggested stronger water had once flowed there. Apple trees behind the cabin still produced a handful of small fruit despite years without pruning. The ranch looked abandoned, not defeated. Inside the cabin, dust coated nearly every surface. Yet everything remained strangely organized. Books rested neatly on shelves. Tools hung where they belonged. A kettle still sat above the stone fireplace. His grandfather had clearly expected someone to return. On the kitchen table rested a single cedar box. Inside were several leather-bound journals. The first page carried only one sentence. "Never trust the first thing desperate men say about land." Thatcher smiled for the first time in days. He lit a lantern and kept reading until long after midnight. The journals weren't stories. They were observations, rainfall measurements, seasonal grazing notes, sketches of hillsides, records of grass growth, water movement, soil quality, even bird migrations. Silas hadn't merely owned Briarstone Ridge. He had studied it. Every season, every year. Near the back of one journal, Thatcher found an older map. Unlike the official survey, this one showed a spring deep beneath the northern ridge. Beside it, his grandfather had written, "Water never truly disappears. It only changes where patient people choose to look." The next morning, Thatcher climbed to the ridge carrying only a shovel, rope, and canteen. He compared the old map to the shape of the hills. Most of the landmarks had changed. Trees had grown. Creeks had shifted. But the rocks remained exactly where his grandfather had drawn them. By midday, he believed he had found the place. He began digging. The work was slow. The ground fought every swing of the shovel. Blisters formed across his palms. Still he continued. Late that afternoon, a wagon rolled slowly along the nearby trail. The driver stopped. An older surveyor with a silver beard climbed down. "You looking for gold?" Thatcher wiped dirt from his forehead. "Water." The man chuckled. "Most folks say there's none left. My grandfather disagreed. The surveyor glanced at the weather journal lying nearby. You knew Silas? He was my grandfather. Recognition softened the old man's face. He wasn't wrong very often. Before climbing back onto the wagon, he pointed toward a cluster of weathered limestone farther uphill. Water likes old stone. Remember that. Then he tipped his hat and disappeared down the trail. Thatcher looked back toward the limestone outcrop. It wasn't where he'd planned to dig, but it matched something else his grandfather had written. When two maps disagree, believe the land. He picked up the shovel once more. The sun dipped lower. His muscles ached. Every swing echoed across the empty valley. No applause. No witnesses. No certainty. Only faith in the words of the one man who had believed he could build something where everyone else saw nothing at all. And as the first stars appeared over Briarstone Ridge, Thatcher drove the shovel into the earth again, unaware that the next few feet of soil would determine not only the future of the forgotten ranch, but the course of his entire life. The shovel struck something that sounded different. Not stone, not hard clay, a hollow echo. Thatcher dropped to one knee and swept away the loose dirt with his hands. Buried beneath decades of soil lay a line of smooth limestone, arranged almost too neatly to be natural. His grandfather hadn't been guessing. He had been following something older than memory. Working carefully, Thatcher uncovered a narrow channel. A trickle of water seeped through the rock, then another. Within minutes, cold, clear water flowed into the shallow trench he had dug. He cupped both hands beneath it and drank. It tasted clean enough to erase weeks of doubt. For the first time since arriving at Briarstone Ridge, he allowed himself a smile. Grandfather, you were right. But water alone would not save a ranch. The next morning he marked every section of pasture with wooden stakes, using Silas Calloway's journals as his guide. Instead of rushing to buy cattle he couldn't afford, he focused on rebuilding the land itself. He repaired broken fences one rail at a time, scavenging usable timber from collapsed sheds. He cleared invasive brush that had swallowed acres of grazing ground. Every evening he recorded his progress in a notebook of his own. Weeks passed. The ranch still looked poor, but it no longer looked abandoned. Word spread through neighboring settlements that the young man everyone expected to quit was still there. Some rode out simply to satisfy their curiosity. Most left shaking their heads. You've got green grass, one rancher remarked. But no cattle. Thatcher nodded. I'll have cattle when the grass is ready. The man laughed. Most folks buy cows first. And most folks, Thatcher replied calmly, spend years fixing the damage afterward. The answer spread through town almost as quickly as the story itself. People began calling him stubborn. He didn't mind. One chilly afternoon, an elderly widow named Celestine Brogan arrived with a wagon carrying sacks of seed. I heard you've been working alone, she said. I don't need charity. She smiled gently. Good. Because this isn't charity. She handed him a folded receipt. Your grandfather paid me years ago. For what? He said one day his grandson might need help starting over. Inside the wagon were drought-resistant grass seeds that Silas had purchased long before his death, but never collected. Thatcher stared at the old receipt in silence. Even after death, his grandfather had still been preparing the way. By spring, patches of green stretched across hills that had once looked lifeless. The hidden spring filled a restored watering pond. Wildflowers returned. Birds nested near the creek. Even travelers passing through noticed the change. One morning a horse breeder named Bennett Crow stopped beside the fence. I've watched this place for 6 months. Thatcher kept hammering fence rails. So have most people. They're waiting for you to fail. And you? I'm wondering if you've got room for another dreamer. Bennett explained that rising land prices had forced him off his family's ranch. He still owned 3 exceptional mares, but nowhere to keep them. Instead of asking for wages, he proposed something unusual. I'll raise horses. You provide pasture. We split whatever comes. It wasn't the arrangement most ranchers would have made. But Thatcher remembered another lesson from Silas's journals. Good partnerships grow richer than good bargains. He extended his hand. You've got yourself a place. Within weeks, Briarstone Ridge held its first livestock in years. Not dozens. Only 3 horses. Yet seeing animals graze across the recovered pasture changed something inside Thatcher. For the first time, the ranch felt alive. Success attracted attention. Not all of it welcome. Late one afternoon, a polished carriage climbed the winding trail toward the ranch house. Roderick Harlan stepped out wearing an expensive wool coat that looked entirely unsuited to ranch work. He surveyed the repaired fences, the flowing pond, and the healthy pasture. "I'll admit," he said, "I'm surprised." Thatcher continued repairing a gate. "I imagine you are." Roderick unfolded a legal document. "I'll buy the property. It's not for sale. You haven't heard my offer. I don't need to." The older man's smile disappeared. "You have no idea what this land is worth." "I know exactly what it's worth." "Name your price." Thatcher leaned against the fence. "You laughed when I inherited it." "I did. You called it worthless." "I may have. So why do you want it now?" For the first time, Roderick had no answer. Instead, he folded the papers and returned to his carriage. This conversation isn't over. As the carriage disappeared beyond the ridge, Bennett walked over from the pasture. "I don't trust that man." "Neither do I." Within days, rumors swept through neighboring towns. People whispered that Briarstone Ridge was drowning in debt. Others claimed Thatcher had secretly borrowed enormous sums to restore the ranch. Merchants suddenly demanded payment in advance. One supplier canceled a lumber delivery without explanation. The rumors spread faster than the truth. Rather than chase every lie, Thatcher made a different decision. He sent handwritten invitations across the valley. Every rancher, every merchant, every banker, every skeptical neighbor. Each invitation contained only one sentence. "Come to Briarstone Ridge during the spring gathering. Walk the land yourself. Ask every question you wish, and judge with your own eyes, not by another man's words." Bennett looked up from sealing the final envelope. "You really think they'll come?" Thatcher gazed across the fields where fresh grass swayed in the afternoon breeze. "They're curious." He smiled. "And curiosity has built more futures than gossip ever will." The stage was set. By the time spring arrived, Briarstone Ridge would face its greatest test. Not against drought, nor poverty, but against the opinions of people who had already decided the ranch's story was over before it had truly begun. The morning of the spring gathering arrived beneath a cloudless sky. By sunrise, wagons stretched along the road leading to Briarstone Ridge. Ranchers, merchants, blacksmiths, bankers, and curious travelers had all come to see whether the stories were true. Some expected to witness a clever illusion. Others came hoping to confirm that Thatcher Calloway had finally failed. Instead, they found a ranch unlike any they had visited before. The once collapsing fences stood straight and solid. Fresh grass rolled over the hills in neat grazing sections. The restored pond reflected the morning light, while healthy horses moved calmly across the pastures. Thatcher greeted every visitor personally. "There are no locked gates here," he said with a quiet smile. "Walk anywhere you wish. Ask whatever questions you have." The visitors did exactly that. A gray-haired cattleman knelt to inspect the pasture roots. "They're thicker than mine," he admitted. A banker examined the ranch books Thatcher willingly laid on the table inside the barn. "There isn't a dollar of hidden debt," he murmured. Nearby, Bennett Crow demonstrated the breeding program that had already produced several strong young horses. "We don't rush growth," he explained. "Healthy stock is worth more than quick profits." By afternoon, the laughter that had once followed Thatcher's name had vanished. It was replaced by respect. Among the crowd stood Roderick Harlan. He remained near the edge of the gathering, saying little as neighbors congratulated the young man he had once dismissed. For the first time, Roderick realized he had not merely underestimated Thatcher. He had misunderstood him completely. Late that evening, after the visitors had gone home, Roderick approached the porch of the old cabin. "I owe you an apology." Thatcher looked up from repairing a saddle. "For what?" "For believing that hardship would break you." Silence settled between them. Finally, Thatcher answered, "Hardship didn't build this place." "What did?" He looked across the valley where lanterns glowed beside the barns. "People who believed they could build something together." Roderick lowered his eyes. He had spent years buying land. Thatcher had spent those same years earning trust. Only one of those investments had continued to grow. Over the next several years, Briarstone Ridge became known throughout the territory. Young ranchers arrived asking for advice. Widows struggling to keep small farms operating found practical help instead of charity. Families displaced by drought were offered temporary grazing agreements until they recovered. Thatcher refused to create tenants. Instead, he created partners. He often told newcomers, "A strong neighbor protects your future better than a weak one." The philosophy spread from valley to valley. Soon several surrounding ranches adopted the same cooperative approach. Season after season, prosperity replaced rivalry. Merchants found steady business. Livestock auctions became larger. Roads improved as trade increased. The region no longer depended on one successful ranch. It had become an entire network of families helping one another thrive. One autumn afternoon, Thatcher unlocked the small cedar chest his grandfather had left behind. Inside rested a faded letter addressed simply, "To my grandson, when you're finally ready." With careful hands, he unfolded the paper. If you're reading this, then Briarstone Ridge survived. Not because the land became easier, but because you became the kind of man who understands what this place was always meant to teach. Land is never the greatest inheritance. Character is. The ranch was only meant to reveal whether you possessed it. Thatcher read the final line twice. When people call something worthless, listen carefully. Often they are revealing the limits of their own vision, not the value of the thing itself. He folded the letter slowly and looked out across the valley. The old cabin still stood. The spring still flowed. Only everything around them had changed. 22 years after walking through the ranch gate with a single canvas bag, Thatcher stood before hundreds of visitors attending Briarstone Ridge's annual harvest gathering. Children, now grown into ranch owners themselves, returned with families of their own. Former apprentices managed successful operations across the frontier. Neighbors who had once laughed now proudly called him a friend. A young rancher stepped forward. "Mr. Calloway," he asked, "what was the greatest decision you ever made?" Many expected him to mention the hidden spring, or the grazing system, or the horse program. Instead, Thatcher smiled. "I stopped trying to prove people wrong." The crowd fell silent. "I simply focused on proving my grandfather right." Those words lingered long after the applause faded. As evening settled over Briarstone Ridge, lanterns illuminated the barns, corrals, and winding fences that stretched across the hills. Thatcher walked alone to the weathered entrance sign that still bore the ranch's original name. He ran a hand across the old wood. Years earlier, he had arrived carrying little more than hope. Now the ranch supported dozens of families, trained the next generation of ranchers, and had become one of the most respected operations in the territory. Yet the faded deed remained tucked safely inside his coat, not because of what it was worth, but because it reminded him where everything had begun. He unfolded it one final time beneath the setting sun. The paper had yellowed with age. The ink had nearly disappeared. Still, he smiled. "They said you were worthless." He looked across the thriving valley where cattle grazed peacefully, horses roamed the hills, and smoke curled gently from the homes of families who had built new lives together. They just couldn't see what you would become. With that, Thatcher carefully folded the deed, placed it back inside his pocket, and walked toward the lights of Briarstone Ridge, no longer the forgotten ranch everyone had mocked, but a frontier empire built not by luck or inheritance, but by patience, integrity, and the quiet determination to see value where everyone else had seen only failure.